Hello everyone and welcome to another video. It's great fun to be in a theme park when it's sunny, but if it starts raining or you even get some lightning, then it can be a very unpleasant experience as well. This is reflected in the guest behavior of RollerCoaster Tycoon 2. The weather in this game has a variety of effects, from guests not buying certain foods when it rains, to paying more for those foods when it's hot, and even to guests riding any super intense underground ride just to get shelter from the wetness outside. There are two aspects to the weather in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, the weather condition and the temperature. The 6 different weather conditions are sunny, partially cloudy, cloudy, rain, heavy rain and thunderstorm. Guests don't really care what exactly the weather is, as all they care about is whether it's raining or not. So for practical purposes there are really only 2 different weather conditions, rain and dry. We'll look at the effects of rain and also the temperature later, but first I want to discuss how the game determines which weather you get next and what the accompanying temperature should be. The reason I re-uploaded this video, by the way, is that I made a very significant mistake in the original. In that video I claimed that guests getting thirstier quicker when it's hot is a myth. But it turns out that is actually true. I also forgot that paths can cover rides, which I now also included. When you start up a new scenario, it is always partially cloudy, which is something that I, and probably you too, never noticed before. Immediately after that, the game determines what the next weather condition will be. 24 seconds later, you will see an indication that the weather is going to transition soon to something different. Well, of course, you'll only see this if the next condition is actually different. It won't show a transition if it selects the current one to go again. Another 24 seconds later, the weather will start updating. First, the temperature will change to the new temperature, increasing or decreasing by 1 degree Celsius every 3.2 seconds. When that's done, the gloom or darkness level also changes by 1 step every 3.2 seconds, if necessary, and after that the graphics change as well, again only if necessary. Once that's all done, the weather condition actually properly changes, and the game again picks the next weather to start the cycle anew. So you first keep the same weather for 48 seconds, then the weather updates, and then you keep the new weather for another 48 seconds. During the update the timer isn't running, and the update can take anywhere between no time at all to over a minute. But how does the game decide what the next weather condition will be? This depends on the climate type and the month. There are 4 different climate types, which are cold, cool and wet, warm and hot and dry. Every scenario has one of these climate types and it cannot change unless you use cheats. For example, Alpine Adventures is cold, Katie's Dreamland is cool and wet, Forest Frontiers is warm and Extreme Heights is hot and dry. Each of these types has different weather conditions available in every month, and here is the list for the first one. Cold. What you see here is up to 23 weather icons per month, and what the game does is select a random one out of these to be the next weather. So if it's April, there is a 9 out of 21 chance that it will be cloudy, as there are 21 icons of which 9 are the double cloud. The chance for partially cloudy and sunny are about half as big, and there is a very small chance for rain, heavy rain or thunder, as there is only one of each of those 3 icons. There are 2 notable things here. Firstly, the current weather has 0 influence on the next weather. You can just as easily go from sunny to heavy rain as from sunny to another sunny. And secondly, not every weather type is possible in every month. In this cold climate, for example, thunder can only occur in April, August, September and October. Actually, in none of the 4 climate types can thunder be selected in March, May, June or July, and neither can heavy rain in June. If they get selected at the end of the previous month, it can still continue into the next, but since May, June and July are 3 consecutive months, it is impossible to ever experience thunder in June and July. OpenRCT2 has a cheat that forces the weather to be a certain condition. This updates it instantly and resets the timer of 48 seconds to the next weather change. In addition to the 6 conditions we already know and love, it also adds 3 new ones that can only be obtained via this cheat. These are snow, heavy snow and blizzard. They behave mostly the same as rain, heavy rain and thunder, except that they're much colder. If you want to have the same weather forever, such as sunny to get rid of the rain or blizzards for winter scenarios, you can freeze the weather, including the temperature, using this button in the same cheats menu. Apart from the weather, every month also has an accompanying base temperature. Since this is the cold climate, these are quite low, down to just 4 degrees in March. To determine the actual temperature it should be, this base temperature is combined with the weather specific temperature. Every weather condition has a temperature modifier which ranges from plus 10 degrees when it's sunny to minus 4 degrees during heavy rain and all the way to minus 20 when it's blizzarding. These are all in Celsius as that is what the game is programmed around, but at the end of this section we will do a summary that includes the temperatures in Fahrenheit. To get the final temperature, you simply add the weather specific temperature to the base temperature. For example, if it's sunny in May in the cold climate, it will be 17 degrees Celsius as the base is 7 and the sunny weather adds 10. If it's cloudy in August, we get the base 11 degrees plus 0, so it will be 11. The lowest possible temperature in the game occurs during heavy rain in March in this climate, which comes out to 4 minus 4 or 0 degrees. So unless you use the cheats to get the snow weather types from OpenRCT2, it will never go below the freezing point. The cool and wet climate has fairly similar weather to the cold climate, but it's a lot warmer. The highest base temperature in cold was just 11 degrees in August, whereas here it's 20 in the same month, and if we see the full sun during that time it will be a sweltering 30 degrees. There is a lot less of that though, as a lot of suns are replaced by different varieties of rain, hence the name of cool and wet. The warm climate bumps up the temperature even more and removes most of the rain. This makes it a very attractive climate if you don't like the rain but still want it occasionally to sell your guests overpriced umbrellas. This is also the first time that we see a month entirely without rain, which is July. The last climate type is hot and dry, which has a lot fewer weather icons compared to the others, and only 3 of them contain rain. There is a full 5-month span where the weather cannot change into anything rain related at all, and even 3 months without the cloudy weather. This is also where we see the maximum possible temperature of 32 degrees, which happens when it's sunny in August, which is quite likely. Actually, this is also possible in a warm climate, and the only difference in temperature between these two is that it's 1 degree warmer in April and 2 degrees warmer in September in the hot and dry climate. To summarize, before we discuss the effects of the weather, here's an overview of all the temperatures. On the left in the orange are the base temperatures for each climate in each month, and on the right in the blue are the temperature modifications that are brought on by the weather types. The base temperatures range from 4 to 22 degrees Celsius, which is 39 to 71 Fahrenheit, and the modifiers go from plus 10 to minus 4 Celsius, or plus 19 to minus 8 Fahrenheit. You may notice that in Fahrenheit the modifiers have multiple possible numbers, which is caused by Fahrenheit being a factor 29 over 16 or 1.8125 higher than Celsius in this game. This causes decimals, and the game can only work with whole numbers, so it has to round down. For example, in July in the warm climate the base temperature is 21 degrees Celsius and in August it's 22. These translate to 70.06 and 71.88 Fahrenheit, which end up as 70 and 71 in the game. But if it's sunny instead of cloudy, we get 31 and 32 degrees Celsius, which are translated to 88.19 and 90.00 Fahrenheit. The difference between sunny and cloudy in July is 18 Fahrenheit and in August it's 19. Because numbers going negative messes even more with this kind of rounding, the blizzard weather effect even has 3 possible changes with 35, 36 and 37 degrees. I have one more temperature fact before we move on. The maximum possible value the temperature can store is plus 127 and the minimum is minus 128 degrees Celsius. For the recent title sequence contest for OpenRCT2, the team of In Error Predicting a Fault, Max Arceus and 30 built a park located on Saturn's moon Titan. Using some trickery, they forced the temperature to always be stuck at the minimum of minus 128 degrees. This is still significantly warmer than the actual temperature on Titan, which is about minus 180 degrees Celsius. Alright, now that we know how exactly the weather works, let's see what effects it has on the gameplay. Firstly, the graphics. When it lightly rains, there is some rain on the screen and the game gets a bit darker. During heavy rain, the number of raindrops doubles and the new ones fall faster. In addition, the game also becomes even darker, which makes it all look really dreary and depressing. During thunder, the rain and darkness thankfully stay the same, but you do get a flash of lightning followed by a rolling thunder every now and then. This works the same for the OpenRCT2 exclusive weather types of snow, heavy snow and blizzard respectively, only with snow instead of rain. If the lightning flash or the other weather effects annoy you, you can turn them off if you're using OpenRCT2. This is all just visual though and doesn't affect the actual gameplay, but what is affected is the breakdown chance of rides. Specifically the brakes failure probability, as it increases from 3 to 20, nearly 7 times as much. There are also other breakdown types, so the ride won't break down 7 times as frequently, but it will do so more often. To see what the real effect is, I ran this ride for 100 years in the dry and 100 years in the wet and checked how many times it broke down during each test. When it was dry, it broke down 328 times, and when it rained, only 302? Wait, that's not right, it should be more, not less. To be sure it wasn't randomness causing this, I ran the test again, but this time with 10 rides instead of just 1. Here the breakdown counts were very close together, but again slightly more breakdowns in the dry. I also checked what happened if I changed the inspection times, and every time the rides broke down about equally as often in the rain compared to the dry. And that's when I realized that I got it wrong. The chance for a breakdown doesn't increase when it rains, but instead whenever you do get a breakdown, rain increases the chance that that breakdown is a brakes failure. Take the Twister Coaster, it has these 5 breakdowns available, and when it's dry the probabilities for each are 25, 12, 10, 6 and just 3 for a brakes failure. This added up is 56, which means that when a breakdown occurs, the chance for a brakes failure is 3 in 56, or about 5.3%. When it rains, the brakes failure probability increases to 20, so now it has a 20 in 73 chance, which is over 27%, or about 4 times as likely. So while breakdowns don't become more likely, when you do get a breakdown, all other breakdown types become less likely and are replaced by more brake failures. This seems innocent enough, but they are quite dangerous actually, as brake failures are likely to cause crashes. Here are 100 micro corkscrew coasters that will fly off the back of the track and crash if a brakes failure occurs at the wrong time. First I ran them for 10 years with dry weather to get a baseline. After 5 years, halfway through the test, 1 of the rides has crashed. 3 years later, 9 have crashed. And another 2 years later, at the end of the run, a total of 25 of the 100 micro corkscrew coasters have crashed. The reason more crash later into the run is that the reliability goes down over time, so more breakdowns occur later. Now we repeat the same test in the rain, and my god, the difference is insane. After 5 years, already 8 of them have crashed, as opposed to just 1 in the previous test. And 3 years later, 51, over half of all of them have decided to explode. In the final 2 years, another 33 crashed for a total of 84 out of 100, instead of just 25 in the dry. And it's not like I have no mechanics around. There are 100 mechanics in this park and all the rides are inspected every 10 minutes. This is the true danger of rain, so if you're playing a scenario with the cool and wet climate where it rains a lot, it's worth investing much more in preventing rides from crashing. One method is to use block brakes, as they prevent a brakes failure from occurring entirely. Do be aware that block brakes aren't infinitely strong and trains will overshoot them if they go too fast. Most crashes happen when two trains crash into each other, so just running a single train will prevent a lot of crashes as well. Lastly, putting a tail on a launched coaster will prevent it from running off the end of the track should an untimely brakes failure occur. For these breakdown purposes, the game only distinguishes between it raining or not raining, so the three different rainy weather types have the exact same effect. For the upcoming stuff we're going to talk about, the open RCT2 weather conditions of heavy snow and blizzard count as raining as well, but not the light snow. It is possible that in the future some of this changes and some of the snow might also count as rain for breakdown purposes to make it more consistent, but as of the recording of this video, they don't. Actually, between me originally recording this and now editing this for the re-upload, it has changed, and now it is the same in all situations. Rain, thunder, heavy snow and blizzard count as rain, while the others count as dry. We have now arrived at the most well-known and annoying aspect of rain. Guests not riding certain rides because they're little wusses who are afraid to get a little bit wet. When it rains, guests will not go on any unsheltered ride. This can have a big impact on your income if you charge for the rides, and I have also had it cause severe overcrowding issues as guests suddenly are all on the path instead of in queue lines and on rides. To mitigate these issues a little bit, it is useful to make your queue lines long enough so that they can fit a few loads of guests in them. If the queue line does fill up, it will now take a little while before the line is empty when it starts raining and your profit won't dry up entirely. There are ways to make the guests go on those rides anyway though, but before we get to that we need to ask the question, what makes a ride sheltered? Quite a lot of rides are sheltered by default and are not impacted by rain. Basically, if it has a roof on either the entire ride or the vehicle, it counts as sheltered. Merry-go-round, sheltered. Topspin, unsheltered. Giga coaster, unsheltered. Giga coaster with yellow taxi trains, sheltered. There are a few ambiguous ones that are either partially covered or hard to see from the graphics. The chairlift chairs, teleporter cabin lift, car ride hovercars and both enterprises do count as sheltered rides. But the time machine, Italian police twist, swinging inverter ship, corkscrew conger eel trains, inverted impulse barnstorming trains and the water coaster flying boats and manta ray boats are not sheltered and guests will avoid them when it rains. Another one that might be confusing is the tunnel track of the dinghy slide and also the coverings you get from using a different entrance and exit style. Unfortunately, these don't count as sheltered, so they have no effect on rain. You can cover these rides by putting them underground or placing path or scenery above them. And if at least 3/8 or 37.5% of the ride is covered, guests will count it as a sheltered ride and will go on it in the rain. Underground is simple to understand, but it's not so clear what scenery items would work to shelter it. Well, it's rather simple actually. Any scenery item that is one full tile or larger placed anywhere above the ride covers it. And since path is always a full tile, all path types work as well for covering rides. Let's do an example with this go-kart. It's currently raining, so nobody wants to go on it. One solution is to build 2 underground tunnels, which cover about 42% of the track. Now guests are perfectly fine riding it again. Those same tunnels made from scenery or path have the same effect, and the walls, while looking nice, aren't even necessary. But what about this roof made out of pellets of cannonballs, will that work? They do make a full roof, but because they're just quarter tile scenery items and not full tile, they won't make the track sheltered and guests won't go on the ride. Funnily enough, some very not solid roof pieces placed very far above the track do properly cover it and guests will ride it now. It gets even more hilarious as literal fountains also work. If I remove them, there will be less water, but the guests suddenly won't ride it anymore. Smart fellas they are. This is similar to the case of fountains being counted as trees in the original game, because treeness was determined by the height of the scenery object, and this fountain is tall enough for that. We're not done yet with examples, as of course it gets more complicated. These two small tunnels, despite covering less than a quarter of the track, are still enough. Why? Because the guests drive 3 laps instead of just 1 around the track. The track length is counted only once, but the sheltered length is counted every time the vehicle goes under scenery or underground. So with 3 laps you need 3 times less track to be covered for it to count as sheltered. Although with all the rounding these numbers are often a bit different in practice, but the effect is definitely still there. You can see this effect in action on this track with just a single flamingo as coverage. As I slowly increase the lap count every time the guests do test the ride but won't go on it afterwards as it's not sheltered enough. This is until we hit 9 laps, then suddenly it is sheltered enough and they'll go on it no problem. For quite a while I was very confused by how this worked, as sometimes my efforts to shelter a ride with scenery did work and other times they seemed to not work. It wasn't until making this very video that I finally discovered why that happened. The game determines what percentage of the track is sheltered during testing, and this cannot change afterwards. Building a beautiful roller coaster, opening it and then covering it afterwards will not work. You have to retest it after you build the cover for it to be sheltered. This also means that you can remove the covering after the ride has been tested and it will still be sheltered. Unfortunately, not all ride types can be sheltered. A swinging ship, for example, will never get any riders in the rain, even if it's built underground, and neither will a whole bunch of other flat rides. Since the game determines whether a ride is sheltered by checking the percentage of the total length that is underground or under scenery, only rides that have a length stat in the statistics window can be sheltered. The one exception to this is the boat hire, which does have a length stat if you build it with a full track, but it cannot be covered. OpenRCT2 added an exception for the maze. It still cannot be covered, but since guests keep up their umbrella when they're in a maze, they have a 50% chance of ignoring the rain and going on it anyway if they own an umbrella. Technically this works for any ride type now in OpenRCT2, but the maze is the only one that allows umbrella use. Sometimes guests will even still go on unsheltered rides, despite the fact that it is raining. If they are specifically heading for that ride, they will ignore the rain entirely and go on it. Guests don't usually choose to head for an unsheltered ride when it's wet outside, but they still might do so from an ad campaign or deciding to go on the ride immediately again after riding it, or already having chosen to go on it before it started raining. Another way to get the guests to ignore the rain is to have the ride not have its excitement, intensity and nausea ratings calculated yet. When this is the case, the guests will just ignore the rain check entirely and treat it as if it is not raining at all. That is why in the shot where I slowly increased the number of laps on the go-karts, the guests did go on it for a short while every time it's increased, as changing the number of laps resets the stats, so it had to be retested. Guests will also always go on free transport rides and ignore the rain, which includes scenarios where the money is disabled entirely and everything is free. The last effect that the rain has on rides is that guests will ignore the intensity of a ride if it is raining and the ride is sheltered. This means that you can build your Skull Crusher 9000 with 30 intensity that has 20 laps and guests will go on it as long as a tiny bit of the track is sheltered and it rains. Of course, this exception also has an exception, and that is that this time guests that are specifically heading for this ride will not go on it. Not many guests will head for super intense rides, but it is possible with, for example, an ad campaign for that ride. The guests generated from that campaign will immediately head for the ride, but will then not go on it if it rains and it's too intense. They might still go on it later though when they bump into the entrance again, as now they're no longer heading for it. That was it for anything to do with the rides, but rain also affects how guests behave when trying to buy things from stalls, and this is also where we see the only effect of the temperature. The most infamous example of this is that guests will pay anything for umbrellas when it rains. With the maximum possible price being 20 bucks, you can easily make thousands of euros of profit when it rains. This will be especially true if you keep the price that high all the time. This way, guests will not buy an umbrella when it's dry because it's way too expensive, but when it rains, they will all suddenly pay the 20 euro price. There are more stalls that are affected by rain, but this time it's a negative effect. Guests will not buy a balloon, candy floss, ice cream or sunglasses when it rains. Any other item, be it food or a souvenir, is fine, but not these four. And now we finally arrive at the effects of the temperature. There is a myth that guests prefer water rides more when it's hot, but that is entirely false. What is true is that guests get thirsty quicker when it's hot, and the temperature also affects when guests buy things from stalls and how much they want to pay. There are 3 temperature ranges in this game. 11 degrees or lower is cold, 12 to 20 degrees is medium, and 21 degrees and up is hot. I know that for you Americans living in places like California, 21 degrees is pretty much still winter. But Chris Sawyer is from the UK, where it's cold and rainy 99% of the time, so 21 degrees is actually pretty warm there. Usually the thirst of a guest only increases when they eat something, but if it's hot, so 21 degrees and up, it will also increase naturally by itself. This is not super fast, and going from 0 to the maximum thirst takes a little under a year. To see the practical effect of this, I ran 2 tests with 1000 guests trapped with access to food, drinks and a toilet, and compared the drink sales between hot and normal temperatures over a 10-year period. With a normal temperature, the drink stall sold about 11,600 items in these 10 years. In the hot test, it is quite significantly different, as here is sold about 23,600 or a little over twice as much. The food sales were not affected by this at all, as about 23,400 hamburgers were sold in both tests. So, when you're playing in a warm or hot and dry climate, be sure to place plenty of drink stalls. The other thing that temperature affects is what guests buy from stalls and what they pay. When it's cold, guests do not buy sunglasses or ice cream, so you might want to reconsider building the ice cream stall as a food stall in a scenario if the climate is cold. The temperature isn't always cold in the cold climate, but it is often enough cold that it could become an issue if the only food you sell is ice cream. And lastly, the temperature impacts the desirability and thus the cost of certain items. Here is a table with every single item that can be sold in shops and how much guests want to pay for it in cold, medium and hot weather. For example, hot chocolate has the same price for medium and hot, but since it's a really nice thing to have when it's cold, they'll pay 70 cents more if the temperature drops below 12 degrees. Ice cream, on the other hand, sells for much more when it's hot compared to medium and especially cold. Although this cold value is pretty useless, as guests won't buy ice cream anyway when it's cold. Some items, like the t-shirt, are not affected by the temperature at all and keep the same price no matter the weather. Keep in mind that depending on their happiness, the guests may be willing to pay, sometimes quite significantly, more than the price listed here, but this is the base price that guests will always pay if they decide to buy the item. And that was the last thing that weather affects. To summarize, rides are more likely to get a brakes failure and crash when it rains, and guests will not go on unsheltered rides in the rain or heavy snow. You can shelter rides that are usually unsheltered with scenery or going underground, and the scenery that works is quite hilarious, alongside the fact that guests will ignore the intensity entirely on sheltered rides when it rains. Guests will pay anything for umbrellas in the rain, but won't buy balloons, sunglasses, ice cream or cotton candy when it's wet. The temperature affects the base price of what guests are willing to pay for the items, with 11 degrees or lower being cold and 21 degrees or higher being hot. The weather itself depends on the climate, of which there are 4 possibilities, with cold, cool and wet, warm and hot and dry. The weather condition is chosen at random depending on the month and climate, and the temperature is a combination of the climate, month and weather condition. If you found this interesting, you should click here to learn all about path ornaments such as benches and bins. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.